We are on the road to NFL Week 14, to the fantasy playoffs, to the fantasy championships, all of that hardware, Shawn, we are going to put on the mantelpiece. I don't really have any mantelpieces here. This is a house that we built 3 years ago. There's not a fireplace in the house. There's a fake fireplace, which is electric, but there's no mantle there. I'm going to have to find somewhere back on one of these shelves behind me to put these imaginary fantasy trophies that we're about to win. But Shawn, it's going to come down to the money and the cash and the bragging rights. That there's going to be all on display. Week 13, a couple of games left to discuss. We had Monday Night Football, the fallout of that, which could be quite significant for the Jacksonville Jaguars, the injury to Trevor Lawrence. But we left the previous show, Shawn, with hopes for you that one of the main event teams would sneak its way in there past Joe Mixon. That did not happen. Mixon with a pretty nice night. So we'll get into Monday Night Football in a moment. But I want to mention at the start of the show, Shawn, for the last couple of weeks, has been doing his Monday article up on RotoViz.com that is not behind the paywall. I will be linking it in today's show notes. It'll give you some of the information that he has dug up on our boy Sam Laporta, our other boy Trey McBride, and a lot of other interesting facts and players that are in there as well. So that article will be linked down below in the show notes if you're listening in. But Shawn, we're ready for week 14. Week 13, though, we have to close out with a couple of quite fascinating matchups. But Monday Night Football, one of those games, again, as always, is on that island. We do get another quarterback injury, unfortunately, in this one.
We do. And it's hard to imagine a more disastrous game for the Jaguars because, they go from, if they win, being the number one seed. And again, that's projected tiebreakers. You're going to have more games played before the end of the season. Obviously, the other teams are going to be in the mix to move some of the things around. But to go from that position, and with the current playoff format, it is just an absolute overwhelming advantage to have that number one seed. That doesn't mean the number one seed will make it all the time. You're still going to obviously take the field over the number one seed when you go into the playoffs. And yet, to be in that position and to be playing a Bengals team that had appeared to pack it in, playing a Bengals team that is starting a quarterback who looked woefully overmatched a week ago, and to come out with an injury to Christian Kirk, potentially, a meaningful injury to Trevor Lawrence, and then also to look bad, right? That's the other issue in this game, is that their defense has really been the element that they could lean on throughout. And we talk about how the different matchups work. One of the things we discussed was that this is a very difficult matchup for Joe Mixon. In the piece, I kind of wrote about that in order to help people see some of the things you can do with the tools, right? Maybe you're not interested specifically in what Joe Mixon was going to do on Monday night, but he gives an example of how you can use just the wide array of RotoViz tools to work through either your start-sit decisions, get a sense for what the likelihood is of a player scoring what you either need or need to not have happen on Monday night, which, those are fun dynamics there kind of either way. And the takeaway is that the Jaguars have been very, very good on defense. You and I have been referencing that over and over, in that this offense has been very bland, hasn't taken advantage of the passing weapons, doesn't use Travis Etienne appropriately, and yet they were in the mix to be the number one seed in the AFC, which maybe isn't quite as heavy or strong at the top as the NFC looks right now. Certainly, you watch what the 49ers did to the Eagles, you know how good the Eagles are. You're thinking maybe those are the two best teams in the NFL. Anybody who has that belief, I don't think you can criticize that in any way, shape, or form. But more depth of top teams in the AFC to be above that group because your defense has been so dominant. Now, a little bit too. You haven't necessarily played that strong of a schedule. But for your defense to come out and get absolutely eviscerated by Jake Browning, who averages almost 10 yards per attempt, to get schooled by JaMarr Chase, who catches 11 of his 12 targets. Now, a lot of these are underneath, but he does score the 76-yard touchdown. We know that he's always capable of that type of play. And one of the things, Colm, that was really interesting about this, one of the narratives going into this game, one of the piece-ish types of things, is that Chase, in the midst of this losing streak, you've lost the QB, obviously the college QB, MVP type of player, and supposedly, as opposed to kind of giving up the ghost of the 2023 season, he's pushing his team to continue to compete, to make a push for the playoffs, to accomplish this anyway. And I think because JaMarr Chase is little and he's fast and he drops passes, and he did have a pass dropped down by the goal line yesterday. So that 12th target that wasn't caught wasn't just, like a throwaway. It was a drop.
Yeah.
But I mean, Chase, as a result, you don't get that narrative of, this guy is a battler. This guy won't be denied. This guy is going to carry his team with guts to a victory or to the playoffs or what have you. And this performance from him on Monday Night Football was really impressive, because it was about as gutty a performance as you can get in terms of a single player on a team seeming to will his team to victory and to make, additional yards, additional plays every single time he had the opportunity to take these underneath passes, to take these hits, to battle for extra yards. He looked really, really good. And then the kind of cherry on top, if you're a Bengals fan or if you're playing Joe Mixon, this vaunted Jacksonville run defense. I mean, they were basically not there, right? I mean, Joe Mixon had those points by the end of the first quarter. Sometimes that's going to happen. The overall line, he still does average under 4 yards per carry. And yet the Jaguars, who looked better against the run in the second half, they did not show up in the first half of this game. And then by the end of the game, it cost them, because you have the injuries and they blow. I mean, just a game that you absolutely have to win.
Yeah, they really did have to win this, but I can see during this game, obviously when Lawrence goes out with his injury, CJ Beathard comes in. Obviously teams will, still try and win, rally around, but during a game, it's hard to sometimes measure the impact that could have psychologically on the rest of their teammates. He does go 9 of 10 for 63. I thought Shawn overall, outside of the Jaguars defensive side of things, I thought offensively they were pretty good. They did run that play again that we discussed in detail that we didn't like, that Travis Etienne didn't get in the end zone a couple of weeks ago. They run the same option play here. He gets in. But overall, I thought that there was a lot of potential positives for them. But now with Lawrence out, Beathard may step in and may get them a couple of wins here, but it definitely is a big drop-off in quarterback performance. You mentioned as well Christian Kirk. We'll see what the prognosis will be over the next couple of days, whether it's a multi-week or a week-to-week sort of an injury for him. Evan Engram gets in the end zone, 9 receptions of his 9 targets, 82 and 1, his first time into the end zone this season. And I guess the talking point for the Jacksonville from somebody who hasn't been talked about at all is Parker Washington, 6 targets, 6 receptions, 61 yards and a touchdown. He came on strong down the end. He also had a fumble recovery from a fumble that was not his. But Shawn, you mentioned Joe Mixon. Also a shout out to Chase Brown, who has 9 carries for 61 yards and a few very explosive ones there, one of them 31 yards. The Jacksonville defense certainly felt like they were on their heels a little bit, and I think they were a little bit shell-shocked after that second quarter where the Cincinnati Bengals put up the 2 touchdowns. Joe Mixon's rushing touchdowns, both of the very short variety, punching them in. But getting back to the main talking point, in JaMarr Chase doesn't have that kind of reputation as being the gritty wide receiver, not the gritty, the actual gritty, get in there, put the team on your back. But the talent level, Shawn, as we have talked about for a long time, of JaMarr Chase is exceptionally high. Up there with Justin Jefferson, I think, is the 2 in terms of pure talent at the wide receiver position. And this was a stunning game from him. You mentioned the 1 drop being right there, another potential chance to squeeze it into the end zone. And the other thing that I would say is the yards after the catch, in terms of many times it looked like it was just going to be a catch and then he's tackled at the spot. He kind of wiggled his way out a number of times for those additional yards. So JaMarr Chase, Shawn, looked exceptional. And his managers will be delighted to see that he has been able to. The week previous, it felt like there was a lot of his production was kind of fluky. There was, tip passes. There was all sorts of weird things happening. But this week felt like, and I'm not saying 149 yards and 11 receptions is sustainable, but that usage in those targets with Brownlee in there, I think we can still get productive weeks and then potential spike weeks like this with him. My thing, Shawn, is the Jaguars defense looked not to the level that they have been in previous times. But Jake Browning also was 32 of 37 for 354 and 1 touchdown in this one, took 2 sacks for 12 yards. Very, very impressive performance overall from him, averaging 9.6 per attempt. Is this just something maybe that we do see quarterbacks sometimes have a kind of stunning performance that doesn't replicate itself? Is that something we can expect? And then the next thing I want to ask you about is Tyler Boyd had 1 pass attempt in this game for maybe the worst interception I have ever seen thrown inside his own red zone. I don't think I've ever seen something like that, Shawn, in my life.
It was interesting in light of the Titans Colts game that we're going to talk about in a second, where in that contest, it was like every third play was a flea flicker. And you're like, okay, I mean, a lot of these flea flickers end up in screen passes. So there's a lot going on to not throw the ball even across the line of scrimmage. But yeah, it's a horrible play. But you can also understand where he's coming from. It also gives you a little bit of a sense.
You can't understand where he's coming from. Tyler Boyd is one of our OGs here. He may be the original Mount Rushmore OT player. But Shawn, that ball cannot be thrown.
Well, no, it can't be. But again, it gives a great example of how difficult it is to play quarterback. Now, obviously, Tyler Boyd's not playing quarterback, but he has the ball. He's supposed to throw it on that play, and he doesn't see the guy. And there's just so much to process. Now, a wide receiver isn't expected to be able to see the guy, expected to be able to process. But I think, again, it just kind of underlines how difficult the quarterback play is. Because, I mean, this is one where, you know.
Is that why quarterbacks are consistently throwing the ball 5 yards short of the line of scrimmage?
No. But it is why you'll occasionally get those interceptions that you're directly to the defensive player. Colm, that play did almost cost the Bengals the game. The commentators claimed it was too cute. I think I would agree with that because you're getting such great efficiency from the rest of the game plan. Zach Taylor, the other person who deserves a huge amount of credit for this victory, so much of what he has done as a coach has seemed uninspired. You think about Joe Burrow's performance in the first month of almost every season. You think about their inability to both manage the pass rush and attack deep during those time periods when they struggle. This is the kind of team where it usually seems like Joe Burrow and JaMarr Chase are overcoming the coaching as opposed to the other way around, which again is just going to be very much unfair. When you've taken your team to the AFC Championship game in back-to-back years, it's certainly a very difficult claim to make that the coach is an anchor on that team. And yet there have been so many games where you're just looking for a little bit of spark from the sidelines, including last week where, once Joe Burrow was gone, I mean, this team seemed absolutely dead. There was nothing that they were running. There was nothing that Browning was doing. They gave you any sense that he was going to be able to complete any meaningful passes to a receiver that would allow you to move the ball for a first down. Obviously, last week, Joe Mixon was stuffed over and over and over again. Then you come out and you have this performance where Browning is accurate and makes very good decisions instantly after the snap and getting the ball out of his hands. But so much of that relied on beautiful play calling, both from an individual play perspective, where what you're trying to accomplish on that play was perfect for the defense, and then the sequencing was fantastic, where every single play they're setting them up for the next one. A lot of misdirection in this game plan. And a backup quarterback who has looked awful came out and had one of the NFL's best defenses on their heels the entire game. And probably to an extent because they were flat, although on Monday Night Football, when you're playing to basically get into that number one seed position, how can you be flat per se? But I mean, he was magnificent. And that only happens if you have guys who were available to you, that they were schemed open, that they got open, and that they were able to continue to work this through. So much of what happens in these games, and you think back to the Sunday night performance with the Green Bay Packers and the Kansas City Chiefs, and we always talk about that Kyle Shanahan coaching tree and all of those different guys where, especially in the scripted part of the game, they absolutely dominate. And you think about that game where the Packers, two 75-yard drives to start the game. You're up 14-3. And because of the script that you began the game with and your ability to execute it, suddenly the Kansas City Chiefs they're knocked back and they're trailing by 11, and they're going to spend the entire game trying to climb back up. This was a game where, the Bengals miss a field goal early. Now, Evan McPherson was one of the heroes. He knocks down 2 late field goals toward the end of the long distance variety, including the game winner. But this is not a game where the Bengals jump out to some huge lead. It's little by little throughout the entire game where they're pecking away and they're executing successful plays consistently throughout to get the job done. You mentioned Chase Brown. It was exciting to see him. I had said on the show last week that we had cut him off of our dynasty roster. That actually wasn't quite the case. We had just left Justin Jefferson on IR through that weekend. And then, Colm, we had kind of a difficult decision on who to cut this week. Should we cut Chase? Should we cut Tucker Kraft? Should we cut Hunter Henry? I was lobbying for Henry. You said you wanted to see him with the different QB. Colm, I still haven't watched that game.
Don't watch it.
And Hunter Henry is an interesting guy. I just, at the last moment, I couldn't get myself to cut Brown. So we did cut Tucker Kraft, who, because we have 3 elite starting tight ends, isn't going to be in the lineup for us. And he's probably not someone who is going to win a title for one of our league mates down the stretch. And he's probably not somebody that you're going to be able to keep through the 16-man cut down. So even though Tucker Kraft, one of those young guns in Green Bay who is exciting, I think it was okay to let him go. If we want to cut Hunter Henry for a big pickup before the playoffs, we can do that. That 30-yard run here by Chase Brown. Now, again, there are different style running backs. Chase Brown maybe not quite as small as people think. In this game, when they needed somebody to break a tackle, to fight through for a yard at the line of scrimmage, it was fairly clear that Mixon was going to be that guy. But the first 3 steps, once those 2 backs take the ball in the handoff in this game, the difference in explosiveness, completely night and day. So I do think that Chase Brown has a role in this team in the future when you are that explosive. And again, he's a guy with an 80-plus percentile freak score. He's a guy with a 95th percentile explosion score. He's a guy who was a workhorse in his final year in college. It'll be interesting to see what the Bengals do down the stretch with him. But if they do battle back into the playoff chase, it's going to hurt him a little bit because, Mixon looks good. Mixon now is on a 4 out of 5 game, or maybe a 5 out of 6 game stretch where he's looked very, very good. And his involvement in the receiving game, he had a big reception early in this one. To see him bounce back there, if you are a Mixon manager, is extremely encouraging because losing a lot of that receiving work to Samaje Perine at the end of last season was a real dagger for his fantasy prospects and seemed to herald the end of his time in Cincinnati. He's bounced back. He's looking good.
Moving on, Shawn, to a game that you mentioned a moment ago that, I think some bizarre plays this week, and some of the most bizarre ones came in this contest. That is the Colts and the Titans. We get Derrick Henry with a big rushing day here. This game obviously does go to overtime, but we get 42 total rush attempts for the Titans in this contest, 21 for Derrick Henry, 16 for Tyjae Spears. Obviously, Derrick Henry did leave this contest since we were discussing on yesterday's show. I did mention at the end of it, isn't in the concussion protocol, but did miss time in this one. So 102 yards for him, 2 touchdowns. We get Tyjae Spears 16 for 75. And then in the passing game, Spears 4 for 13 of 6 targets. Derrick Henry just the 2 targets, but 1 of 18. Chikakonko 3 of 60. Chikakonko 3 for 62 of 6 targets. And Hopkins 12 targets, Shawn 5 receptions. He does get 75 in the touchdown, but the efficiency of the targets to Hopkins, not great here from Will Levis. Gardner Minshew, 2 passing touchdowns, 312 yards. Zach Moss didn't get the hit that people may have thought he was going to get based on Jonathan Taylor not being available. 9 for 51 on the ground for him, 2 for 6 in the air. Shawn, looking at this game, wide receiver production for Michael Pittman and for Alec Pierce. Alec Pierce more so due to the fact that he was averaging 33 yards per reception. He goes 3 for 101 on 6 targets. But Michael Pittman was, splitting this offense with Josh Downs. Downs has 5 targets in this contest. We get 16 for Michael Pittman, 11 receptions, 105 and 1 touchdown. I mentioned some of the bizarre plays on this on the Monday edition of the podcast, where we have 2 block punts, one of them for a touchdown. We have a 2-point conversion that gets returned by the defense for a touch the other way. Just a really bizarre game that ends 31-28 in overtime, a win for the Colts. What was your thoughts?
The AFC South is fascinating because it's simultaneously minor league football, but also really exciting football and very relevant football for fantasy football managers. You mentioned the huge game from Derrick Henry. He was rumbling like it was 2020, 2021.
I thought you were going to say it like it was 1970.
He definitely has that throwback vibe when they get that big body out on the edge.
He's going,
to behold.
It's like it's a truck. There's a truck coming down the highway. Just get out of the way.
This game, even as you're watching it, is hard to process because there are so many bizarre things going on. The first thing we should probably start with is Will Levis, right? He's the player who is interesting from a super flex perspective. If you're thinking about dynasty, somebody who came in, he has that 4-touchdown game in his first appearance and since has been bad. And I think that the issue here, when you watch Will Levis, you see what all of the college football analysts will tell you, which is that he more or less can't play. And his throwing motion it's very athletic, right? But it's unusual. It doesn't look like it's been coached. It's sort of a sling that doesn't use the whole body, doesn't use the whole arm. He does get it out fast. He does get it out with power. Colm doesn't get it out with a ton of accuracy. And a lot of the decisions are odd. And yet you love to see his competitiveness, right? This is a game where despite his inability to complete even half of the passes, and some of the incompletions are absurd, right? I mean, they're sidearm slings to just random spots on the field. But I love the fact that when DeAndre Hopkins is being his DeAndre Hopkins self, and I don't think that we're breaking any news here relating to the fact that Hopkins has worn out his welcome a lot of different places and has really positioned himself as one of the most selfish players in football at this point. Will Levis in the first half is laying into him on the sidelines, which that was absolutely hilarious. Love to see that. Then there's a play in this game where it's kind of a fumble interception. His arm is jostled as he's throwing it. It's an empty hand, and yet the ball doesn't clearly get loose before it comes forward. So there's a long discussion with the booth over whether it's a fumble or an interception, what the consequences of the two things are. If the defender actually caught it, which he appears to, which kind of makes it irrelevant, whether it's a fumble or an interception. But as soon as he's losing this ball, Will Levis is sprinting after it. And he immediately, after the defender picks it off / recovers the fumble, stands up and tries to go forward. Will Levis steals it from him. They go to the ground. He's not sure if he gets touched, so he actually runs all the way for a theoretical touchdown. He had been touched. But you love to see the awareness and the competitiveness. This game simultaneously made me feel even more like Will Levis can't play at the NFL level and love this guy to death. He was so cool in this game.
He also kind of got helicoptered around in the air on a play where he gets absolutely crushed by the defender. But I think, Shawn, we can give him we'll put the competitive tag on him and we'll leave it there. The accuracy tag is definitely not there.
Then you look at the other side, right? And Gardner Minshew, one of my all-time favorites.
Magic.
I mean, we really need him to be bringing jean shorts back to the masses. Call him this early touchdown pass to Alec Pierce, exactly what people are looking for. Pierce has been a guy who was trendy in best ball in the offseason, hasn't really been involved at all for the Colts so far, in part because Josh Downs has looked so good in the breakout, and in part because Michael Pittman is always going to draw a ton of targets. 16 targets in this game for Michael Pittman, including the game winner. So many different routes where he is running some type of crossing pattern. Minshew hits him in stride. He beats the press coverage off the line. Once he catches it, he continues to run after the catch. This is the version of Michael Pittman, who was going at the 2-3 turn last season. He was fantastic in this game. And yet you look kind of at the overall numbers, the overall results, and despite the two receivers there blowing up, as you mentioned, the Colts did struggle to consistently move the ball in this game, which was kind of odd. And part of that was that, I mean, they probably should have abandoned the run earlier. You have those 19 carries for just 51 yards for Zach Moss. Anytime your running back touches it almost 20 times on the ground and averages less than 3 yards per carry, that's going to be putting a lot of dings in those individual possessions. When you put the 16 incompletions for Minshew on top of that as well, you have a lot of unsuccessful plays. As a result, so much back and forth in this game. And you had mentioned some of the crazy plays again yesterday, but watching them, I was blown away by the way they were able to get to the punter. You have one of the punts blocked with the guy basically not even getting his leg moving at all. You mentioned the fact that we had a 2-point conversion return.
Unfortunately, that punter, and again, on one of those as well, the punter did pick up a pretty significant injury.
And that's the downside of it. And the reason why you've got to actually block the punt, because it is a dangerous play. And so you got to either block it or get out of the way, else you have the penalty. Obviously, it was sad for him. He did look in a lot of distress. Nick Folk comes on and does a fairly nice job of punting. This is a game where it kind of looked like those blocked punts were going to cost Tennessee the game in a variety of ways, because you have the punter also as the holder. And so there's a kind of a missed hold by Ryan Tannehill, not anything flagrant. And it probably is one where Nick Folk actually still has to make that kick. But you miss that as a result, then you go to overtime. So Shane Steichen, again, I mean, this is a Colts team that I would argue just simply is not very good. The Titans are at home. The Titans do have some interesting pieces. They have a lot of toughness. You could argue that the Titans at 4-8 are, a few unlucky breaks from actually looking like a pretty good team from being in the position the Colts are in instead of the other way around. And yet they're also a very beatable team. But Steichen has taken a team that lost Anthony Richardson and wasn't a good team with Richardson, and now has them in the playoff picture because of the variety of interesting and savvy tactical moves that they make throughout. Because it's not just that you block those punts, but again, I mean, you have that missed extra point. And if you don't have all of those things, then even with the performance from Minshew and Pittman and Pierce, you lose this game to the Titans, which would have been a bad loss for them.
They also didn't have Jonathan Taylor for now and for a good chunk of the season as well, whether that was at the start of the season or at this point in time. So he's doing a really nice job there. That division is interesting in terms of the standings, and we have seen obviously a real improvement in a number of the teams in that division to give it that depth. Moving on though, Shawn, to a division that doesn't have a lot of depth, but still has the Atlanta Falcons atop of it. That is the NFC South. We have the Carolina Panthers losing a close game to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 21-18. The Panthers now 1-11. We did talk about the trade, that where their first round pick this year has gone with the Chicago Bears, and they look set up to be the first overall pick, but will not be the benefactors of that. But in this one, we get some impressive performances on both sides. We get Chuba Hubbard, 25 carries, 104 yards, 2 touchdowns. Really strong day from him. Dominated the backfield, 8 rushing attempts for Miles Sanders in this one. Then Sanders gets 2 targets to the 0 targets the way of Hubbard. But Mingo in this, Jonathan Mingo, 10 targets for him, leads the way for the Panthers, 6 for 69. The Adam Thielen experiment seems to have completely disappeared and cooled off. He does get 6 targets, which is second highest on the team, but 3 for 25. And DJ Chark, 4 targets, 3 for 56. Shawn, on the other side, Rashad White does not get 100 yards in terms of the rushing yardage, but he could have got there in this one for people who watched the entire game. He gets 20 carries for 84 yards and a touchdown, but has a chance to probably get to the end zone with that last carry that he takes, but he does slide down, which I believe he slid down at the 18-yard line, which would have got him the additional yards to crest the 100 and obviously added that additional touchdown. But outside of that, there's a number of players with 2 carries in the game, but no more than that. So he completely dominated the backfield. We do get 1 carry for Chris Godwin, 1 for 19 and 1. The disappointing part, Shawn, and the question that I have after we talk through this is obviously going to be Mike Evans this season and Chris Godwin's season, but Godwin has 3 targets, no receptions in this game. Mike Evans, on the other hand, has 12 targets, 7 receptions, 162 yards, one of those being a 75-yard touchdown, and, of course, that touchdown to go along with it. Then Rachaad White, 5 targets, 3 receptions, 22 yards. So White not getting as much in the passing game these last couple of weeks, but doing a really nice job in the rush game overall. But I guess the talking point has to be Mike Evans, and then the counterpoint to that has to be Chris Godwin in terms of how the season is progressing for both of those. And I did mention this yesterday, but Mike Evans, with that yardage total, put him over 1,000 yards for the season, his 10th straight season. I think they can measure up that gold jacket for Evans as he walks towards the Hall of Fame.
He's been extraordinary. And the thing that stood out in this game is that the 75-yard touchdown includes a huge chunk after the catch. And it hasn't
something
hurt
that you don't often see with him. But in terms of after the catch yardage, it was pretty straightforward. It was off the straight line variety.
Well, of the straight line variety, that's fine, though.
But off the speed.
You can still run. Yeah, I mean, an older, tall receiver who, has been, to an extent, a jump ball threat, a wall off the defense type of threat. I'm always
catch it and fall down type of threat.
Yeah, I mean, I think you watch that play and you're thinking to yourself, Mike Evans is going to make a ton of money in free agency, even though he's old, because it's not just the stat line. When you see that run and you see the extension on the touchdown portion at the end, I mean, this was a crazy leap. The body control, the extension of the football to score it. You think about, all the times the teams get down to the 1, then they commit a false start or they get stuffed on the first play and suddenly it's 2nd and goal from the 3 and then you run a pass that's incomplete and then very quickly you go from an automatic score in terms of how the team is processing it, in terms of what the probabilities are. And again, it's not automatic because of what I'm describing here. To a situation where now you're staring down the barrel of a field goal. Obviously, the fantasy managers love it when you get in, but it's a huge play for your reality team as well. He looked great. The thing that kind of rescues this game a little bit for Chris Godwin is he does have a rushing touchdown. It emphasizes, again, where he is when he has the ball in his hands. But this was a game in not great weather in which neither quarterback completed 50% of their passes. And I mean, they both looked bad. This is the worst that I've seen Baker Mayfield look all season. You have a game where Mike Evans goes for 162 and Baker Mayfield throws for 202 total. This is similar to the Trey McBride, Kyler Murray situation where the superstar managed to do it in a game where the quarterback did nothing and played poorly. We had Mike Evans and Chris Godwin as both being significantly undervalued in fantasy football this year. It's been kind of crazy to track when you see that one of those claims turned out to be wildly inaccurate and certainly extremely counterproductive when you drafted Godwin and put him on your teams. The other pick has been one of the biggest league-winning picks of the entire 2023 campaign. So hopefully as many listeners as possible took the cheaper version of that and do have Evans.
What is interesting,
I guess I still believe in Chris Godwin, but Mike Evans has proven what he is in an amazing way.
He definitely has. And it's interesting, if you look at their overall season-to-date stats, Mike Evans now has 61 receptions on the season. Chris Godwin has 53, 8 receptions behind, but it's where the yardage totals are different is just huge. There's 400 yards between them, 606 for Godwin. Mike Evans, 1,012 at this point of the season. And Mike Evans also 10 touchdowns to Chris Godwin's 1 touchdown. So they're getting this similar amount of receptions, but after that, the deviation is dramatic. And there's always that concern with Godwin that he may be used underneath a little bit more and so on, but this is not really what we would have anticipated. And, at that point, heading into the season, if I was leaning one way or the other on the clock, I would have definitely been leaning the Chris Godwin way off the two here. But Mike Evans, a bit like we talked about with JaMarr Chase, and they're obviously different types of players, but Mike Evans has showing time and time again when if you do look to maybe write him off that a little bit soon, it's not really going to work out for you. So he is in great shape here as we move forward for the rest of the season.
And
Shawn,
Colm, you talk about choosing Godwin if you're on the clock with both guys available, and when you look at the evidence going into the season and you look at their profiles over the last several years, and especially when you consider that Godwin last season was playing in a very short time frame coming off of a significant injury.
Yep.
Their profiles are very different in terms of the peripherals, but they're very similar in terms of the production. And so I think when you look at that and you see one player is younger, one player is now no longer injured, one player is going to have targets that are of the shorter variety and thus probably fit better with what defenses are forcing you to do in 2023 and are probably easier to execute, then you're thinking to yourself, the safer pick that probably also has more breakout upside would be the younger guy with a profile that doesn't require as much to be successful. And yet what we've gotten is the exact opposite. And again, that speaks very highly for Mike Evans. It's also something that's interesting because I think that if you want to work through kind of how this happened and you think about the Baker Mayfield situation in Cleveland that got him, pushed out of there, you think about all of the battle of words and all the bad feeling between him and Odell Beckham. There's definitely a historical case with him where there are certain types of passes that he's been able to execute well at the NFL level, getting the ball to guys down the field, and then lots of other types of plays. And you think about the struggles that he had with Beckham, the struggles that he had at times with Jarvis Landry, and you can see where that would manifest in the successful deep targets to Evans and unsuccessful short and intermediate targets to Godwin. I think that when you try and really thread that needle from an analytical perspective, you're asking for something very, very specific to determine the season. And so usually that's going to be a trap. It could very easily have been the opposite way, where Evans is the guy that he doesn't have the good rapport with, that Evans is the Odell Beckham in that scenario. But that hasn't been the case. And so it has been interesting. Until this game, I thought that Baker Mayfield had played about the way that you would hope for Baker Mayfield. It's not going to be, league winning from a fantasy perspective. Obviously, it's not going to be something that carries you in reality. This is a team that came in 4-7, despite having not played a very difficult schedule. But it is, borderline competent football in a way that so many of the teams, especially with the QB injuries, haven't really gotten. This game here, I would argue, did not even rise to that level. Of course, again, the conditions were difficult, and on the other sideline, we saw the young QB continue to really, really struggle as well.
We definitely did. Shawn, as we were recording this, lots of injury news filtering through as we record. A few updates. I mentioned Christian Kirk and Trevor Lawrence. Christian Kirk, core muscle injury that is expected to need surgery. Rehab for that generally around 8 weeks. So regular season seems to be out of the question here for Kirk moving forward. So for managers who may have had him in their lineups heading towards the fantasy playoffs here, obviously looking around to see what other potential options there is. And then Trevor Lawrence, high ankle sprain from Doug Peterson. They're generally week to week, but we do have a high ankle sprain as well for Ramondre Stevenson, who we talked about on the Monday show. Feels to me like, high ankle sprains usually in the 3 to 4 week range. So we'll see what happens and how. Obviously, there's different severities, but Trevor Lawrence going to miss multiple weeks, it would sound like there. And the last one, Shawn, the Jets have released quarterback Tim Boyle and are signing Brett Rippon off Seattle's practice squad. Obviously, I mentioned on yesterday's show that the Packers beat the Rams and Brett Rippon was the quarterback for that particular game. So the Jets quarterback merry-go-round could continue. We didn't get to talk about this, Shawn, but after we recorded yesterday as well, some information filtering out that maybe a certain quarterback doesn't want to play quarterback for the Jets for the rest of the season. But just a weird situation up there in New York. We'll see who's the starter come this weekend.
Colm, we heard that Aaron Rodgers is reaching out and trying to mentor Zach Wilson. So I'm sure that will have a happy ending.
I decline comment. We'll move forward. John sent in a question to Shawn today on Twitter, and via DM, and I wanted to mention it because I think a lot of people will be interested in the value. We've done a lot of conversations around the value of Sam Laporta in Dynasty and particularly in tight end premium. And realistically, at this point, it's nearly impossible for it to get any higher than we talked about last with him being the tight end one. But Trey McBride is somebody who maybe over the course of the season has really changed for, maybe not exactly for us who were big Trey McBride enthusiasts, but for people who maybe weren't as enthusiastic, his rise and now the departure of Zach Ertz and obviously how he's been used in this offense, even since Kyler Murray has come back, people may be interested in what sort of price we would have in terms of looking to acquire him, or if people were trying to sell high, I guess, at this point. But John's question came in, and he mentioned he's relatively new to Dynasty. He said he's in a 12-team league with tight end premium score, and he said he's extremely weak at tight end with only Logan Thomas healthy. He said he's been offered Trey McBride for his first-round pick next year, which he thinks will probably fall between picks 8 and 12. And I always mention in the preseason when you're trading first-round picks, very hard to know if they end up at one side or the other. But when you're at this stage of the season, it should be pretty clear if the team's heading towards the playoffs. This here for him particularly, and then we'll get into general price, I guess. But if you're in a team that's making it towards the playoffs and you only have Logan Thomas and you can add Trey McBride, I think you're really set up. But then the other part of it is, what are your thoughts on getting McBride for next year's first round pick? He said he knows we really like him, says he loves the shows and so on. But Shawn, for me, this was one where I did mention to him that, just go and accept it. But I also said we would discuss it more in detail. This, for me, if you can get a Logan Thomas in a tight end premium format for a first round pick, and then it's a late first round pick, and you're also in a playoff hunt, I think this is one that I would do 10 times out of 10. But on that, you can say if you agree or disagree. But the next part also is, what sort of value would you have on him at the moment, and where does he sit in your tight end rankings?
And this is a great question because I think it really illustrates the swiftness with which young players can move in Dynasty. And it's a fun challenge, right? And a difficult puzzle because on the one hand, you don't want to be sitting there with a lot of very wide range of outcomes, young assets, year after year after year, without any type of production base starting to build through your roster. On the other, if you are giving up on the young players too early, or you're not investing in some players with these really wide outcome ranges, then you're not going to avail yourself of the opportunities that they can provide. And it also just sort of illustrates the joy and the roller coaster ride of being a believer in some of these young guys. Because, again, the 2023 season has been crazy. There have been really, really low lows. And so anyone who has had a rough season and has kind of mixed some of the least successful type of moves, who has, a Jahan Dotson or, a George Pickens, somebody who has drafted a Quentin Johnston in Dynasty. And again, I think you've got to think of Johnston in at least a vaguely similar type of way that you would think about a Trey McBride, because really the first time that we saw McBride anything like what we're seeing now was in week 17 last year, when he blows up after an extremely frustrating first 16 games. Now, it was different because he wasn't getting the same types of opportunity that Quentin Johnston has gotten. But
he wasn't getting the opportunity, but we also were like sitting all season being like, why isn't he getting the opportunity? So I don't know which is worse, to see him to get no chances or to be getting chances and do nothing with them.
Even then, like as you get to that final month, right, Trey McBride is getting run. He's getting routes. He's not drawing targets. And so then the question is, well, is it better to have routes and get no targets, or is it better to get routes and get the target and then be in a situation like Quentin Johnston where you're just batting the ball away? Now, one of the things, again, I think for Johnston is that he's gotten a lot of just unfair criticism, in that a lot of these targets that he's getting criticized for are difficult targets. And the Chargers have not gotten him a lot of clean opportunities to make plays. if you have 4 or 5 targets a game where the defender is, interfering with them, you think about MVS and the drop a couple weeks ago, and then MVS with the blatant pass interference this last week. I mean, a lot of the targets that Quentin Johnson has gotten, people are hanging on him. And so then it's the thing of you got to realize what you have to do at the NFL level, and you have to you've got to pull that other arm through, right? And so you're either getting the pass interference or you're getting both hands on the ball to try and make the catch. It can't be neither one of those two things. Anyway, didn't intend for it to be a quick Quentin Johnston digression there. But so there have been plenty of things that have been frustrating, and that doesn't even include the injuries that we probably discussed too much. On the flip side of that, there have been these amazing moments and developments of players, and some of them after a stretch that looked like it was going to be, more devastating than the other way around. One of the things that I talk about in the Monday article is that through the first 5 games of the season, Trey McBride had played 39% of the offensive snaps. And so one of the things here that is such a great lesson with Trey McBride is that evaluation of football players is difficult. And I kind of joke in the article that the experts have a really hard time with it. But part of it is just that you've got a lot of guys out there, and evaluating anyone is difficult. And I remember, going back to my time coaching tennis, and had this, great opportunity to recruit a young lady who her match results would indicate that she was an absolute star. She shows up at our university and doesn't seem a lot of the things that you are expecting to see, you don't necessarily see. You're not necessarily seeing great conditioning. You're not necessarily seeing great speed. You're not necessarily seeing that practice competitiveness. And so, those are 3 things that you do want to see. And as a result, you're a little bit nervous. We play a match. I coach both the men and the women, and they're at sort of these 2 different locations, which makes it obviously impossible to see all of the matches that are taking place. And she's playing number 1, despite some of these concerns, and despite the fact that we have other very, very good players. And she's playing a superstar from the other team. And I'm there with her for the first set, and she loses 6-1. And all of the concerns that I had are right there, right? So I discuss it with her a little bit. I leave. I go watch the men's match at the other location, do some coaching there. My assistant coach comes up to me, sits down, and says, Marcella just lost in a super tiebreaker, which means that she had come back and run through that superstar opponent in the second set. And from there, it was off to the races. And even though there were things that we worked on and we tried to improve, because, you're always trying to improve. Colm, you and I are trying to improve consistently as podcasters. You're always trying to get better. She did get better, but she was amazing. And her ability to hit the ball was like nothing I've ever seen. It was far, far better than mine, I can tell you that. When I would kind of hit with her, I would be, hitting all my normal types of shots, which are decent. And she would be able to take whatever blend it was and effortlessly hit back the most beautiful, perfect ball of all time. And she was good. She was really, really, really good. And not every example of some player is difficult to evaluate follows that type of template. There are all different types of ways in which it can be difficult to evaluate players. And some people are going to be like, this dude played forever in college. He had 1,000-yard receiving season in college. He runs like a sub 4.6 40, right? Trey McBride is more athletic than Kyle Pitts. But we all focus on Kyle Pitts. We're like, well, if they just used him, he's athletic. It's obviously Arthur Smith's fault. Trey McBride is a better athlete, right? Trey McBride is an absolute transcendent star. He played less than 40% of the offensive snaps over the first 5 weeks. He averaged 3.2 points per game.
They had Zach Ertz, sorry.
Zach Ertz, nobody wants Zach Ertz now that he's been released, right? We love Zach Ertz as well. Zach Ertz has been a very, very good football player. And I think that as you come in, young coaches, I mean, one of the things that's the weirdest about this story is that the Arizona Cardinals are not trying to compete in 2023. They're trying to build a base to be successful in the future. And the thing that you would expect to see with that is opportunities for young players. And so it was a little bit surprising when you have all those Clayton Tune reports that they bring in a quarterback to play over him. You have a running back in James Conner who probably is not going to be your running back the next time that your team is competing for the playoffs. And then you're starting Zach Ertz over a Trey McBride. It was a weird dynamic in terms of how they're developing that. And I think the coaching staff would just say, look, part of what we're trying to do is to create a competitive identity and an identity of not giving up on games. Like, we're going to try hard. We're not going to go out there and tank and put a bunch of overmatched young guys in and embarrass our squad trying to get an early pick next year. That's not what we're doing. You could have patience with this. And that once Trey McBride proved what he can do, we went with him and we released Zach Ertz. What else do you want from us? And so I think that perspective you can kind of understand as well, even though it's not completely convincing to me. I think that their evaluation of Trey McBride was inaccurate early on. And yet things have worked out. And so my point here would be that player evaluation is difficult and that you do have to have some patience with the players. And the result of that is that when you see someone like a JSN being used incorrectly, when you see him not early enough in the reads, when you see him with a QB who can't get off of those early reads and get to where he is, it's discouraging. It is a problem for fantasy. It's not like it hasn't been a huge problem for us this year. Not getting enough points from JSN in best ball, not having him as a viable starting option for most of the season in redraft, it's been a problem. When you're thinking about it from a dynasty perspective, you want to be patient. At the same time, you want to continue to process and to believe the new information that you have. And I say believe, just it's relevant, right? And so you have this tension, you have this tug of war between looking at the big picture and taking into consideration the player's full profile and the things that they have done. And again, Colm, players don't seamlessly transition from the college level to the NFL level. And you do have busts. You do have guys who are disappointing. Certainly Treylon Burks is really struggling. Rashad Bateman is just a guy. You have players who are less successful even than that in terms of like a Jalen Reagor. But the guys who put up incredible numbers at the college level, even among top prospects, and have this level of athleticism that is above the normal NFL level, which is extremely high, you do want to make sure that you're patient enough with them. And Trey McBride is a great example of that this year. So he has this really bad first 5 weeks. And yet when you look at the stretch starting in week 8, and that was the first time that he played 60% of the snaps, week 8. He leads the position. Now, part of this is because he has one extra game than Hawkinson and Kittle and Laporta. But in terms of receptions, he's gapped the tight end position. He has a 29% target share. His mix between air yards, yards after the catch, and catch percentage is fantastic. And it's not to say that you have to have that balance, but when you do have a good balance, then it gives you room for one area to decline and to become a little bit less extraordinary, because you're not going to sustain this type of performance over like every game or every stretch of games the rest of your career. You're going to have some down weeks. The trade offer here is one that you would expect more after a down week or a down, 2 or 3 weeks. And that kind of thing is going to happen at stretches, going forward. He's going to have a down couple of weeks in 2024. He may have a down month in 2025. Travis Kelce has had some down stretches this year. George Kittle has had some moments where he hasn't been as dominant, in part because of the players he's competing with for touches. But with Trey McBride, you have a situation where the quarterback play will probably be decent. I mean, Kyler Murray is probably a decent floor, not a great ceiling kind of guy. You don't have the target competition that is a short-term concern. And then you have this fantastic talent profile. Colm, where would you have Trey McBride, in your redraft rankings for next year, just, generally speaking, and where would you have him in your Superflex tight end premium dynasty rankings Even before this game, we had McBride, or I had McBride moving to the 2-3 turn next year in redraft, which, I mean, again, the value that these tight ends are giving you in a format like the FFPC is pretty extraordinary. The ability to win the flex, and that's the thing I'm seeing in all of these best ball teams that are making the push too. And some listeners are going to be like, well, I mean, best ball is not really the same type of thing. But when we're thinking about how do you win the flex, that's always been what RotoViz has focused on. There have been time periods where zero RB was very clearly the way to do it. There were some seasons like this one where we argued that maybe you want to look at some different types of possibilities. Those best ball teams that made the huge push, so much of it was because some of those teams have Laporta and McBride. And so you have one in the tight end spot, you have one in the flex spot. Obviously, our main event, we played one of them in the tight end spot, one of them in the flex spot this past week. We have a situation in week 14 where, very sadly, Trey McBride is going to be on his bye, but because we have both guys, we still have a star in the tight end position, and we can move Zay Flowers into the flex. It gives you a lot of, flexibility there. Where do you have these guys when you're ranking them? And then how much would you be willing to actually give up for Trey McBride today in a dynasty trade?
The value, we mentioned this one as a first round pick. I think the value is going to be higher than that, and it's going to start to, again, when we're saying about our rankings, I do think that people who maybe aren't as much in on Trey McBride may find these over the top, or may think that it's a little bit too enthusiastic. I would have him right there as a top 4 tight end in dynasty. I wouldn't mind if somebody wanted to take Mark Andrews ahead of him, but the only 2 that I would take ahead of him is Sam Laporta and TJ Hawkinson. I would have him as my 3rd tight end in terms of tight end, and whether it's premium or not premium. And obviously Travis Kelce gets dinged down in that because of his age, and if you're looking ahead to next season and redraft, he'd be that little bit higher. And when we talked a few weeks ago, Shawn, with your rankings, I did mention that I thought I still would take Sam Laporta over McBride, and that's still the case. But I also thought that even though as enthusiastic as I was about McBride, I was thinking 3rd round might be a little bit high. But I think right at the back of that 2nd round is where I would be looking to have him now.
And you would say it's just a complete lock unless some type of injury happens down the stretch that TJ Hawkinson will be in round 2 of tight end premium redraft next year.
Yeah, I think there's a potential, depending on what people feel. I think Kelce will still go in the 1st round, maybe a little bit further back. Maybe there will be age concerns. I think we'll have 4 tight ends in the first 2 rounds next year, and that'll be Hawkinson, McBride, Sam Laporta, and Kelce. And it'll be interesting because I think we could have a very tight end heavy first 3 rounds, because you're going to have Mark Andrews mixed in there as well. And I think he'll probably be in the 3rd round coming off his injury. So that's obviously tight end premium. And I would be very interested to hear other people's feelings on McBride at this point, because we've been kind of waiting for this, whereas other people might be saying, yeah, he's had a couple of good games over the last 5 weeks. It's probably not going to last. He's in a bad offense. Is it sustainable? Whereas we're on the opposite side saying this is sustainable and even can be exceeded. Like you're mentioning, the athletic profile. Like I'm waiting for the game where he's hit 20 yards down the field, when they're at their own 25 after a kickoff, and he takes it to the house. That's when I think the more mainstream excitement might come in along with it. I think we're probably still very early to the party here.
Well, you think about what he's doing from a target share perspective, and Hawkinson is the one guy who's kind of in that range with him again over these last 6 weeks. And Hawkinson is about to have Justin Jefferson come back and step on his. You have someone like a George Kittle who is above 25%, with Travis Kelce just around 20%. You think about Kelce there and what he might have to do over the closing stretch of the season to even stick in the 2nd round, and because that target share in the Chiefs offense where he's not actually even competing with anybody. I mean, they're having a hard time getting the ball. So that's been night and day. This is a little bit more what I expected last year and was completely wrong about, was that teams would be able to take him away a little bit because the Chiefs are not offering other threats. So there's a possibility that Kelce actually bounces back in tandem with a Rashee Rice emergence.
Yeah.
But I mean, the other name here that I think we could easily get in round 2 by the end of the season is a Dalton Kincaid. And Dalton Kincaid is a good kind of point of reference for this question because Dalton Kincaid was drafted around the 108 in this type of format this year without having done anything. Now, we say without having done anything, you can definitely deserve that ranking in that spot. But if you have a player coming in a Kincaid who probably, I mean, what you're looking for, what his ceiling outcome would be something like what Trey McBride is doing now. Now, maybe he can sustain that for a full year, and you could argue that Trey McBride is a flash in the pan. But, I mean, what you want is the type of production that we're seeing from McBride. People were betting on that with Kincaid, especially when you consider that some of the other players going in that range were Addison and Quentin Johnston. Then I don't know that I think the pick looks pretty decent. Certainly the pick looks better than a Johnson. The kind of tension between what Justin Jefferson and Hawkinson can do from a target share perspective and how that filters down to Addison over the long term. And I still see Addison as being kind of this Calvin Ridley-esque type of player where Ridley played off of a Julio Jones in a very effective way in those early years in Atlanta. The thing that we were arguing for was just, don't use your first round pick there. Take a shot on a receiver and use your second round pick and get a Sam Laporta. That's worked out. So we're very happy about that. But I'm very high on Kincaid as well. I think where he was going in this last draft, it's a very clear-cut pick that you want Trey McBride there. And I think that after the last couple of weeks, I mean, for me, Trey McBride is moving toward being a 2 first-round pick player. Now, not 2 first-round picks where one of them ends up being the 102 and one of them ends up being the 104. But when you're talking about averaging out those first-round picks,
a 108 and a 108.
Yeah. I mean, 2 of those would be what you would need to give up to get a Trey McBride right now with what he's doing and with how that impacts the current fantasy setup. Because again, if you get tight end production, it completely changes your roster versus your opponents, but also with the difficulty of finding the flex scoring. Because that's been the real storyline of 2023. It's that, these dead zone running backs, they're interesting guys. Some of them have hit at points, and that's fantastic. But, I mean, Ramondre Stevenson, somebody that we like, that we stuck with, that we've been playing, I mean, he hasn't been any type of league winner to start with. He was expensive. Now he's hurt. Again, illustrating all of the different problems that you have with running backs. Those running backs, even as they fall in ADP, most of them are going to continue to be landmines, and you prefer just to have the Etiennes and the Chuba Hubbards. And we didn't talk about the Carolina Panthers portion of that game, but Hubbard was probably the most impressive back I saw all weekend. Looked absolutely fantastic for the Carolina Panthers. Now, it's still problematic if you're trying to get those running back points and you've got to wait till this time of the season. You needed to score points to be in a position for those points to matter, right? So you got to work through those types of things. But running backs are going to continue to be landmines in those middle rounds at wide receiver with this exploding gap between the superstars and everybody else with all of the busts that we had. And one of the problems with the busts in 2023 means that we now can't rely on those players also in 2024. And one of the reasons why we were taking running backs in some of the dead zone areas is that the wide receiver options were very poor. Now, it's not that there weren't some individual guys that were going to hit, but generally speaking, you were having to massively reach on those wide receivers. They were not going to give you the points. Nothing about their profiles and nothing about anything that we saw from the tools. We talk about the win the flex tool. The implied scoring from those wide receivers was not very good. You look at the range of outcomes tools. The range of outcomes for those wide receivers was not very good. You think about, how am I going to get flex scoring, and tight ends in 2024 could be the answer.
Let's see. It's going to be very, very interesting, but it may be a tight end landscape like we've not seen in a long time, or maybe have never seen ever, with the early value on some of those guys that we mentioned. But excited to see what happens as we move forward there. Thanks again for sending in that question to John, and anyone who has questions like that from time to time. We try and fit them in as much as we can. Send them in. You can send them my way on Twitter at Overtime Ireland, or email them over at rotovizradio@gmail.com. One final programming note as we get ready to finish up today. We are in the main event final this week against some of our listeners, as we mentioned on the Monday recap show. I am going to re-release that draft episode where myself and Shawn drafted that team that is set up to potentially take down that main event championship, but also then head towards the race. So I will release that on Thursday on the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed. So make sure you are subscribed to get that one as well when it is available. Then we will be back as well with the Friday podcast. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. And until we are back, have a good one.